In the early 2000s, Dave Wachowski and his girlfriend Marion Hart had already hiked many parts of the Appalachian Trail and decided to hike the southern part of the Virginia Trail. The Virginia Trail is about 166 miles long and goes through George Washington and Jefferson National Forests from Roanoke County to Pearisburg in Giles County. They both felt that they needed a challenge, and the trail they wanted to undertake was more remote than the others and was also the less travelled part of the trail. After preparing the necessary equipment, they made their way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail. The couple had planned their journey so as to finish at Damascus, which is a town in Washington County, Virginia, which they especially looked forward to as it was a place of stunning natural beauty with a great view of the hills, peaks and creeks. By the time they reached Damascus, they figured they'd be well and truly exhausted after a long journey. They began their trek early in October, where the leaves would look beautiful with their many colours. They started their hike in perfect weather, and the first few days were fairly uneventful, but after a few nights, things started to get weird. The part of the trail that they had reached had a designated camping site, but Dave and Marion didn't particularly feel like socialising in the event of other campers turning up, as they'd got used to the peace and quiet of their own company and the beautiful surroundings. Instead, they went in search of their own quiet location and found one a short distance in a small clearing. They then set up camp, cooked a meal, and were so tired that it was not long before they hit their sleeping bags. Around 2 a.m, Dave was suddenly awoken by Marion, who was frantically shaking him and telling him to grab a gun as someone was walking around their tent. She would normally have thought it was just another camper, but what spooked her was that the person right outside the tent appeared to be running a knife or a sharp object along the side of the tent, while at the same time circled around them. Whenever Dave hiked in remote locations, he always took a Colt 1911 single-action semi-automatic, as well as a Tourist Judge 5-shot revolver, because you never know who or what you might encounter. He then took his Judge out of his backpack and then waited silently, expecting the worst. After a few tense minutes, with only the sound of the wind in the trees, they suddenly heard a snap and then a crunch. Someone or something was in the woods, very close to the back of their tent. Dave could not sit quietly in the tent, knowing that something outside could be stalking them, and grabbed the torch and gun and slowly made his way out of the tent. It was almost pitch black, as the fire had gone out and the October moon was only giving out a faint glow. Dave told Marion to stay in the tent, but did not immediately turn on the torch, as he did not want whoever it was to know that he was outside the tent and did not want to give away his location. He just stood deathly still, waiting for the next sound, when suddenly snap and crack, and it did not sound like an animal but a person, as the steps appeared heavy. Dave then quickly turned on the flashlight, which then flooded the surroundings of where the noise was coming from, and caught the sight of someone darting behind a tree. He then screamed at them to go away and that he was armed. Dave continued to shine the torch and slowly approached the area where he'd seen the person hiding behind the tree, while at the same time was pointing the gun. All of a sudden, from his right, he heard the sound of someone running through the woods and pointed his torch in that direction. He decided not to chase whoever it was into the woods, as it could put his girlfriend in danger, as there could be more than one person. Dave returned to the tent and did not go back to sleep. He instead sat outside the tent, guarding it until daylight. The following morning, when he had a different perspective on the surroundings, he walked around and looked for signs of the creep that had scared the life out of him and his girlfriend. He found a boot print in some dirt, which was very close to the tent, which did not come from his boot or his girlfriend's. The boot print was confirmation that someone or some people had been wandering around their campsite at 2 a.m. in the morning, and this completely freaked him out. He did not inform Marion, as she was already spooked and did not want to make matters worse for her. Dave felt trapped, as they had come so far into the journey that they had come too far to turn back and had to keep walking, as they still had 2 days left. After packing their equipment, they quickly left the scene and left at a much faster pace, hoping to reach their destination sooner. Whether it was animal instinct or if he was just plain spooked, the whole day Dave felt as if they were being followed. Later that night, when it came to set up camp again, Dave found a location close to a cliff where he could erect the tent in a small overhang so that they could see if anyone was trying to sneak up close to their tent again. After setting up camp, they cooked a meal and ate inside the tent. Still frightened from the night before, David handed Marion the 1911 gun, and he kept the judge and assured her that he would be sleeping that night with one eye open. Fortunately, Marion drifted off to sleep quickly, but Dave stayed wide awake, just staring into the dark forest, listening to the silence. Fear can keep a person wide awake, and Dave stayed awake for hours waiting for something to happen. However, in the end, sleep got the better of him, and he drifted off. He woke sometime later to the sound of someone rifling through their stuff outside the tent. He quickly grabbed his gun and woke Marion, at the same time whispering to her to be very, very quiet. The glow of the fire, which had fortunately not gone out, showed the silhouette of someone against the tent, leaving no doubt that there was somebody outside. Dave then screamed, "We're armed, so get the hell out of here." With that, they dropped what they were doing and quickly ran off. Dave then jumped out of the tent with his gun drawn, ready to start firing at whoever was fleeing. He looked around and found all of this stuff strewn around and scattered about. With his gun in hand, Dave walked to the edge of the woods in the direction that the person had fled and found himself at a nearby creek. From there, he could clearly see some tracks alongside it. Further along the creek, he could see the flickering of a lantern, and then 3 more of the lights appeared from the other side of the woods. He quickly headed back to the tent and told Marion to start packing immediately, as they were leaving that very minute. They were in such a hurry to leave that they only packed the goods of value, but left the tent along with a few other items and hurriedly made their way back to the trail. It was still in the middle of the night, but they were not prepared to hang around and face whatever it was that was intent on stalking and scaring them. Dave did not know whether it was his imagination, but as they made their way along the trail, he continued to hear the sound of voices and the cracking of branches, and kept looking over his shoulder to ensure that they were not being followed. At this stage, both Dave and Marion were out of their mind with fear and were now nervous wrecks. And what made matters worse was that they were still a long way from anywhere. They were literally on their own and had not even come across the occasional hiker the entire time they were there. It was at this stage that Dave realised that they could both be in serious danger. Even though they'd covered a lot of distance, they could still hear something behind them in the woods, and their fears went to a whole new level when they rounded a corner and he looked back and he saw someone step out onto the trail. He just stood there, standing and staring at them. It was at the same time as the sun was coming up, so the figure was just a dark silhouette. After a few seconds, David had enough and wanted answers and yelled out, "Who are you and what do you want?" But they just stood there in silence and stared, then slowly walked back into the woods. Dave and Marion then quickened their pace and ever so often looked back expecting to see their tormentor, as Dave's instincts told him that they were still following them. It seems that whoever had turned their hike into a nightmare had finally given up after they reached the end of the trail, and they were both tired and suffering from nervous exhaustion. Dave and Marion had made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming prey for a bunch of hillbillies. Dave and Marion never did find out who they were or what they wanted, and whether they wanted to just terrorize a couple of hikers for fun. Dave did not like being hunted and would never return to find out.